just waiting for Paul to join. Hey, Paul.
Welcome to Sideways.
I think we might need to rearrange.
You're gonna have to cuddle.
All right. Perfect. All right. Thanks everyone for joining. We thought it would be fun to do this little tasting of wines that we really like from the Becky Wasserman portfolio. And before we talk about the wines, just the background on Matt and myself and Paul. I met Matt when I worked at RN74. I also met Paul when I worked at RN74 for the first time. And Matt and I both moved out here and about 4 years ago. And I'm currently the lead sommelier at restaurant Michael Mina. And I'm a master sommelier as well. And
then I'm the beverage director for Lazy Bear here in San Francisco. Yeah, like Jeremy said, we both moved out here, about four years ago or so. Him from New York, me from St. Louis. And yeah, found we had a lot of things in common with wine and a lot of things to argue about with wine too. So hopefully you'll get a little bit of that. But one thing we've always agreed on are some of these really great wines and some under the radar producers from Wasserman. So we're gonna talk through some of those, give our thoughts on the tastings, why we selected them. Obviously Paul will chime in with a little bit of his thoughts on all of that. And just have a kind of a casual discussion about some really fantastic wines that we should pay some attention to.
Yeah, and one of the things that I love about this portfolio is, of course, you have, top names like Leger Belair and, really famous wines, but there's and those are fantastic, but there's so many hidden gems that...
Actually, I do have to correct you because Leger Belair, it's been a while since we haven't worked with him, so I don't want Louis Michel to listen in on this and not correct them.
Well, there's there's a number of really famous estates,
yes.
Becky Wasserman works with, and
sure.
Then there's also a lot of just really under the radar wineries that a lot of people might not know about, and over the last couple of years, I've really enjoyed watching these producers, vintage after vintage, make really great wine. So we each decided to pick two wines from Becky Wasserman that we're just really excited about, and we'll kind of lead the discussion on those wines and then pass it off to the other two.
Yeah, we'll let Paul introduce himself and the Wasserman portfolio a little bit as well.
So yes, I'm Becky's son. I grew up in Burgundy, moved here I was 1. Worked for her when I was actually as a teen. I used to go translate in the cellars when I was 12, 13. Moved to the States in the mid-90s and actually to be a musician, not in the wine trade. And I know Matt, I play the bass.
Me too. Yeah, all right.
I saw you on the guitar on Instagram not too long ago, but anyway. But, paid the bills by getting a job in a wine store, and then did everything wholesale, a lot of retail for many years. And then finally decided it was time to cut the crap and go back to the family, which was 2012. And just with my background in retail, my love of other wines, I thought it was time for us to branch out of Burgundy because we were, 99% in Burgundy. Immediately started hitting the Loire and other regions, and yes, the book has moved way beyond the boundaries of Burgundy, and we're super, super, super excited. It's particularly fun for me because I get to travel France a lot and meet these wonderful people, and I think they fit right in with our Burgundians. They're the same type of people.
Right on. Well, with that, thank you for that. With that said, let's jump right into the wine.
So the first wine is one that Matt.
Yeah. So essentially, I think we're talking about under the radar producers, but we're going to start with, I think, arguably under the radar. But there is a very specific reason why I chose this. It's Marcel Dice. This is the 2013 Mombourg Grand Cru. So why I wanted to throw this in there is because I don't think it's any stretch to say that Marcel Dice is one of the top 3 iconic producers of Alsace. In that I'll include like Trimbachens and Humbrecht and all that. But I think they play a very important role that I think often gets missed. And I think it's worth talking about. And not to dwell on other producers, but just to give a spectrum. I think I typically think of Trimbach as being very, laser focused, very classic, like calibrate your palate to Alsace. Zinhumbrush being more stylized, very intense, but playing with, acidity, sometimes sweetness and botrytis, things like that. But I think Marcel Dice actually plays a very important role when it comes to the wines of Alsace in a few ways. And I think he wears a few hats. One of those is that I think as Wasserman puts it, he's the foutu de merde, the shit stirrer. So I think he's, as many have, had some disagreements of how wines have been categorized in Alsace, and has worked to change them quite a bit. I also think he's a little bit of an archivist in style in a lot of ways. He does a lot of co-planting, so that has a big effect, which I think addresses something that I think actually was a problem caused by a lot of the Alsatian designations, namely that by stating when the Alsace Grand Cru AOP was originally established, it stated that you had to declare variety on the label, which led to a great loss in biodiversity, and a lot of these kind of great clones were lost. Essentially, co-planting brought back a lot of those old styles, which I think is super, super important. And even apparently he wasn't the only one that felt that way, because in about 2005, they reformed the law to exempt even Grand Crus from having to state variety on the label. So you have something here that's co-planted to Pinot Blanc, Pinot Gris, Pinot Noir. And I think it just, because of that, just rounds out a lot of really, really beautiful things here. Oh, man. It's just stunning. Specifically, this wine I really like for a lot of reasons. So Momborg is unique in the sense it is the most heavily planted site that Marcel Dice has, just under 13,000 vines per hectare. So to me, what that says is that he's planting so much that there's less to go around into each of the grapes, which means that you get a lot more phenolic influence because the grapes aren't swelling up in size a lot. I know a lot of producers like Karl Leuven, things like that, will do that in the Mosel. And I find that adds to super, super intense wines, almost exaggeratedly so. And I think this is a great example of that. Yeah, I mean, it's just bursting at the seams. And the only way you can pull that off is to have this really beautiful acidity and this minerality that comes from with this really sharp limestone hit. So just to give you some basic notes on the wine, this whole cluster press for up to 12 hours, natural yeast fermentation, aged for 12 months in the barrel, is one of the earliest to ripen, which actually probably is why I'm guessing why it was planted so densely, so you don't, so basically you don't get grapes swelling too much. So because I feel like these vines are probably more vigorous than a lot of the other ones. It is also always dry, which is great because you get something that is dry, but also has this richness and fullness that might almost like hint at sweetness or botrytis in a way, but it doesn't. It just finishes completely bone dry, which one makes it great, but also makes it great for us with pairing, pairing pretty well. Yeah, you guys tried the wines? Any thoughts so far on just the profile?
I'll add a couple things because I think we have 10 minutes per wine, so I'll keep it quick. So yeah, so the field blend co-planting is about biodiversity. They're going further today. They're planting fruit trees in the vineyards. They're really about that. Jean-Michel likes to say, why make a wine with one letter when you can make a wine with an alphabet? I think that now that we've worked with them for many years, first of all, they're one of our favorite families ever. Every single one of them, the brothers, Jean-Michel's wife, the little sister, everybody, they're crazy. They're workaholics. They're super bright. They'll stop at nothing. Actually, the co-planting was only allowed in a couple Grand Crus. So in theory, they shouldn't be co-planted, but that's, Jean-Michel. But it's really about diversity. And I think there is a difference in the Dice wines. I think the diversity is playing a role in the energy of the wine because it's a massive wine, often. 13 and 14, which I have a little less. It's a Grand Cru on a hill that did not erode, and it sticks the furthest out into the plain, so it's really exposed to the hot winds. And that's why you get no botrytis, which makes it dry. and it's the reason it's aged in barrel. There are only 2 wines aged in barrel at Dice is because of that, because of the size. And it's an awesome wine. It's a big dry wine. It's in some vintages their most Burgundian wine, just in size and delivery, in the oak aging, no new barrels, or maybe one, you know, every so and so. Very usually a little you get that sense of reduction on the nose, or something a little toasted, a little grilled, a little nutty.
Yeah.
And it's yeah, they're a phenomenal family. This year we will be adding a dryness scale on the back of the label, so there are no doubts about what is what, which we've been tasting with them for 3 years. Trying, it's difficult. The wines that are sweet tend to be sweet on the front, but so dry on the back that it's really annoying to call the sugar out because they're in 2 parts. That's all I got to say.
Yeah. I will add one thing too about you mentioned about the no botrytis, things like that. It's also one of the added impacts of planting super densely is that since you get smaller berries, you get more influence, more phenolic influence, because there's a higher skin to juice ratio. But you also, because of that smaller things, the clusters have a little more room for the air to go through them. So you're able to get a little more airflow, keeping you away from botrytis. I'll also say too that I mentioned that this is the non under the radar producer of them all. It was the first intro I had to Alsatian wines well before I tried the other ones, and it still stands up as a standard bearer in a lot of ways, and it's a complexity that I think really you can't. I don't see in a lot of. I mean, I see great complexity in other producers, but there's definitely a stamp that Dice has on the wines, and that's no doubt due to some of the co-planting where he does. I was trying not to out anyone too much. It's a very unique style that I think needs more attention, because I don't think as some ways we always categorize them properly.
Yeah, and one of the probably my favorite aspect of this wine, in addition to it just being an overall delicious, super complex wine, is the element of terroir that you see in the Dice wines. I think my biggest problem with Alsace is sometimes you can miss that because it's so focused on varietal and site. And Mamborg's a really good example, because there's some great producers there like Weinbach who make a single varietal Gewürztraminer. So for me, you're really not tasting Mamborg, you're tasting Gewürztraminer. And although it's a great wine, I don't know if it's as, to me, these wines, they're so much more about the site, not about the variety.
If Jean-Michel was here, he'd probably jump into your arms because that's exactly what he wanted to do.
Yeah. It's true.
We taste the wines every year. We no longer care about the percentage of what's in it. The site is clear, whether it's Altenburg versus Schonenberg with all that. And we've fallen in love with terroir, not variety. And that's what he wanted from the beginning.
Right on.
Yeah. So with that, we're going to go to Paul's first pick.
Okay.
If anyone has any questions, feel free to comment with them, and we'll get to them as we can. So go ahead, Paul.
Thank you for letting me pick 2 wines. So
you're welcome. Yeah.
Emmanuel Augereau and the Anjou. So I was told to go see this producer by Karine Serral from the Côte Rouennaise. And I was backing into it because we had Patrick Baudouin. I didn't want to add anything on, but I showed up. His parents are the sweetest people on the planet. He just is a nonstop smile. Everything he says is punctuated by a smile. And as we went to, and he was 27, 28 when I first met him a few years ago. And as we went to the vineyards, we started talking about wine in the car and the culture, what he knew about wine. We started talking about, okay, who do you want to be? And he's talked about Boudinot and Tessa La Roche and how he'd like to be somewhere. He was just so clear with what he wanted to do. Went back to, started tasting the wines. And I'm like, okay, this young, this geeky, this short. So there we go. So family domain, his father was already pretty famous for sweet wines. The dry Chenin are all him. And, they start with no botrytis and originally no malo. And that's very much in the line of Thibaut, who Boudinot, he respects very much. Since then, I guess he's moved a little closer to his other hero, Tessa Laroche, whom I absolutely adore as well. And so the mallows happen. He lets them happen. Occasionally in a vintage with low acidity, he'll block them on the young vines. Spilit is the name of the terroir. It's an unusual rock. It's not rare, but you don't see that many. It's basically an alteration of basalt. It's a very dense, hard to break rock. And he isolated the terroir in 2014. And that's the wine that just convinced me I got to work with this guy because he's just going to be one of the greats. So there you go. It's super for a wine from what we call the Black Anjou. So the Anjou that's on schist, on more volcanic stuff, as opposed to the White Anjou, which is Saumur and limestone and east from there. It's actually so focused, so laser sharp. I have the 18. I think you guys have the 17. But it's so precise, laser focused. Despite the fact that he doesn't block the mallows, it's aged in big Burgundian demi-muid, so 500-liter, 600-liter barrels. No sulfur on the press, bottled with lowish classic sulfur. And it's just such a beautiful, sharp, precise, salty version of Anjou on volcanic soil. And I love it.
Yeah.
I'll let you guys say what you think.
It's a pretty wild wine. I mean, to be honest, I had no idea what I'd never heard of the soil type before until we got this bottle in a couple of days ago. But tasting it, it reminds me a lot of one of my other favorite Loire Chenins that's also I just learned in the last couple of days also planted to this soil, and that's the Eric Morjat.
Morjat, that's the other guy.
Those wines, I just find, I never connected that might not be grown on schist. It never occurred to me because you think of that terroir as just like very homogenous, because that's what you read about in the books. It's all schist. So it's really interesting to see.
It's Litus, right, from Eric?
I'm sorry?
The wine on Spilit is called Litus, I believe, right? Yeah. Phenomenal wine, too.
It's also amazing. I think this is a testament to just even organic practices. I mean, with Chenin Blanc being a grape that's very prone to oxidation, the fact that there's no sulfur, that there's time in barrels, things like that, it's still so fresh. Like, it doesn't get, it gets just the right amount of nuttiness without kind of overwhelming, which I think sometimes Chenin can. And actually, I think that's why I love it. Is it's always sort of like on the edge of falling too far into oxidation. And this is beautiful. And it doesn't need to be protected. Like this is what the grape wants to be, and this does it so well.
Chenin, I mean, you can do anything with bubbles, sweet, dry, natural, a little more classic like this. And it just has so much, the pHs are so low, the acidity is so pungent that you can throw anything you want at it. And it just works. I mean, such a phenomenal grape. And yeah, this is one of the linear, precise, really tense ones. And, lots of energy, lots of straightness, lots of precision, actually, I get a lot of salt out of it as well.
Paul, we have a question as well. Someone asked if volcanic wines made from grapes grown in volcanic soil, are they best when young or aged for a certain number of years?
Oh, no, they can age for a very long time. On Chenin specifically, so there are quite a few wineries we have outside of California, but one of them is Coulade-Serral. And we tasted going back to 67, I think, once. And I think I particularly remember the 73 was phenomenal. And obviously, when they have sugar, and I know that's not very popular, then they can go on for a century, and they're immortal almost. But as dry wines, the oldest I've tasted are old Coulade-Serrals. You know, it was in the old days, so there were variations, but a few of the bottles are just mind blowing. So,
and I would add too, before we move on to the next wine, that I think that ageability note for volcanic wines, I think it goes for white or red. I mean, we've seen it in Sicily, we've seen it in the Loire. I mean, they make beautiful wines, but
Alsace.
Yeah, Alsace. Yeah, of course, all the soil types there. But the other answer to that is just try them whenever you can, at whatever age you can, and you know that's the fun. Just doing a little self-investigation.
Yeah. And one last thing that I'd mention about this, that, you know, for those of you who haven't tried those Jura wines, not all of them are grown on this soil type. So there's also, he makes a single vineyard, Le Bonne Blanche, which is, some of you may have had the Piton Paillet wines, same vineyard. And that's, if my memory serves me well, all schist based. So pretty
Bonne Blanche. He has 2 7 years as well, and a third coming, and so some great Chenas there.
Cool.
So my first pick is one of my favorite wines at the moment. This is one of those wines that I could drink probably any night of the week. I also love that we're tasting it after Chenin Blanc, because a lot of people, when I pour them for this, we poured this by the glass at Michael Mina, they think that it's Chenin Blanc when I first pour it for them, because it's so yellow and appley and pomaceous, and it has this really great core of acidity that reminds a lot of people of Chenin Blanc. So this is Jurançon Sec from Domaine Castera, and this is the single vineyard Tozy, which is new to the domain. Frank Lahore moved back and kind of re-involved himself in the family domain, which goes back a couple of generations, in I believe 2014, and he introduced these single vineyard bottlings, which is something that you really don't see a lot of in Jurançon, which is ironic because it was one of the first regions of the wine world to be classified and have vineyard designations for tax purposes. It's as old as, you know, Tokai or Chianti or a lot of other regions that we think of as these really historic regions that were parcellated vineyard by vineyard. Jurançon was one of the first, but it's just amazing to me that there aren't enough single site expressions. And I love sweet Jurançon. I think when people think about Jurançon, they think about the sweet wines, but dry Jurançon is one of my favorite wines of the world, and certainly one of my favorite wines of France. I think that there's not really that. I mean, there's always new discoveries to be had in France, but when you think about an entire wine region that hasn't been, you know, fully discovered, the southwest corner of France is really the region that, to me, is the wild west of, you know, a lot of producers doing great things that the world just doesn't know about yet. So for those who haven't had a dry Jurançon or Jurançon before, typically they're a blend of Gros Manseng and Petit Manseng. And these grapes are late ripeners, and they retain a really, really high level of acid. So even though it's very warm down in this region, which is almost, it's in the foothills of the Pyrenees Mountains bordering Spain, the grapes retain such an incredible level of acidity that you don't see with a lot of southern French whites. So really, really great pairing for any dish that has a lot of acid. My favorite pairing for these wines is, I love Grenoble. So that's a really traditional French sauce from the Savoie, which has parsley, lemon, capers, and I love it with these wines because they're just so piquant and spicy. And I'll pass it off to Paul and Matt.
Okay, so yeah, again, a young nerdy guy who knows exactly where he's going, and I think it lives in the same kind of universe as the Vin de Spirit, and because it is based on acidity. I think that blind, a lot of people would go to Chenin, and the reason is
actually,
Paul,
Paul, let me interrupt because I think our question actually is going to be well framed for what you're about to say. Do you consider this to be typical of Jurançon Sec? Because I think that's where you're going. So answer as you were, but just if you could address that as you go forward.
So I do. So the other thing about Jurançon Sec that's very similar to Chenin is there's a component of tannin as well in the wine. You know, you feel some phenolics, and they can be on the rustic side sometimes on Jurançon Sec. And I think where Franck is, and I actually have one vintage late. You're on 17, right?
Yes,
I'm on 18, so even one more vintage. It's just getting finer and finer and finer. So it's the same to me. It's the same family as Chenin. It's just they're cousins. And so your wine's based, and in this case, on searing acidity. I mean, it's violent. I love that. I think you guys love that. I think maybe the nerds love that. But it's exciting. It's, you know, it's an upper. It's crazy energetic because of that acidity. Same zone of pHs. Were a little lower in Jurançon. I think the highest pH he's ever had is 315. I think this is around 295, which is, you know, super low. This does not go through Malo without even blocking it. It just won't. Yeah. So you got that added, you know, electricity in it. It's stunning. I am too, and thank you for mentioning the Southwest as a region. We now have Cahors. We're looking at Irulagi. We have Jurançon. We have a genius Fronton and a very small but genius Marcillac. I think it is the new frontier. There are tons of weird varietals that have yet to be rediscovered, that are rediscovered, that there are only single bottlings of, only one guy making here and there. It's a fascinating region. The reds, for Southern reds, stay super low alcohol. So that's taking us out of Jurançon because there's no red in Jurançon. But anyway, yeah. There we go.
The one thing I would say, you know, obviously we just talked about a lot of the similarities for the Jurançon Sec and Chenin Blanc. I think where these grapes differentiate themselves is in the sweeter versions. Yes. I think when they're dry, they're extremely acid focused. Yes. But the sweeter versions, I think, you know, anything Chenin Blanc based is going to lean more tree fruit, a lot more of that like bruised apple. And still like sweet, but yeah, but you get more tropical when you get on into the sweeter versions of Jurançon.
And that's because a lot of sweeter Chenins have botrytis, and most sweet Jurançon does not have botrytis. So
very good point.
You get these crystalline, like super intense tropical flavors with the sweet wines that are made in a passerelle method where the grapes are dried on the vines like raisins. And, you know, to me, the wines are like some of the most decadent tropical sweet wines that you can imagine. They're passion fruit, guava, flavors that you really, there's very few wines in the world that make me think of those flavors, but super, super exotic wines. And Castere also makes some sweet wines that are incredible. Everyone loves Sauternes with foie gras, and it's great. Nothing not to like there, but Jurançon and foie gras is next level.
Well, if you want acidity in your sweet wines, it's Jurançon for me. It's Mosel, and it's Hungarian Tokaj. I mean, if you want equal acidity to go with your sugar, those are the three that, to me, just do it. You know, and the rest are more based on, you know, more exotic, rounder fruits.
So, Paul, before we move on to the red, before we have one more question. So, with this level of acidity, do you think that's something that's producer specific or terroir specific?
It's variety, and I'm sure terroir specific, but the varieties are just so low in pH, and you know,
like you could not make a medium acid wine from ferment or anything like that. Same, you know, just the same thing. You couldn't do it here.
I mean, you probably could deacidify, you know, throw a whole bunch of baking soda in there or something. But no, they're wines that are built on acidity. They're downhill ski racers. They're not, you know, that's for people who, you know, want to be woken up. Here's your coffee and here's your orange juice. You know, here's your kicking the ass, basically.
There you go.
Sorry to say, put it that way, but they're fascinating because of that. And yeah, I think it's variety based. I mean, yeah, pHs of under 3 are not that common.
Great. So let's we'll take a chance to move on to the reds here. But first, I'll say if anyone's interested in any of these wines, you can direct message Becky Wasserman via Instagram. Is that correct, Paul?
Yep.
Yeah, great. So
thank you.
Moving on to the reds here, we're going to go to Northern Burgundy with Dominique Gruyere from Epinoy, which I was amazed when I first tried the wines of Epinoy, because they were something that was sort of left out of the curriculum for study for, in any of the certifying bodies. And it's a real shame, because they're really fantastic. And, you know, you talked about Southwest France being the new frontier. I think Epinoy would qualify as the old frontier. You know, It's like that. It used to be one of the great terroirs for Pinot Noir in Burgundy, and you know, obviously that was a long time ago, and you know, things have changed quite a bit. Our taste in wine and all that stuff. You know, a lot of things. I mean, this is much closer to Champagne than it is parts of the rest of Burgundy. But I think as far as Yon department, the department that holds Chablis, most people go to Irancy, which I love. But Epinoy has a really distinct style to it, which I think is endlessly fascinating. And actually, I just found this out as I was doing a little research here, is that the name etymologically refers to thistles. Which actually really shows well in the wine. It's got this sort of brambliness, like sharp brambliness to it, like a stinging nettle note that I think is really, really pretty fascinating. And I mean, when you taste these, they go from what we probably previously thought of as not being part of the curriculum for study. I mean, some of these, especially Côte de Crécy, could be Premier Cru, Grand Cru. I mean, they're really beautiful. They make really, really beautiful wines. So, and I think this is what great importers do, is they exalt certain styles, certain grapes, certain producers, but more than anything, they bring to the forefront regions for wine that we haven't been looking at. And that's why you're getting into things like Southwest France. You're also, you're looking forward to that. But I think looking back and drawing out what's so great about Epinoy is super important. And I'm actually going to write some emails to make sure we get this as part of the curriculum, because everyone should be trying these. Aside from that, it's also a great story, because Dominique Gruyere is like the original heartbreak kid for wine. The story, I'll give a little summary of the story, but it's pretty fascinating how horrible of a time he had starting up this winery. He wasn't, his family was in the wine business. He didn't immediately go into it. Studied a few different things, wound up going in, going to the military, wound up meeting a winemaker from Orange in the Southern Rhone, and stepped at the top. And they owned a plot in Epinoy. Oh, we're back. Sorry.
You're back.
Yeah, there we go. All right. So it was a little too cold. So Dominique helped out and eventually bought the plot in 1990, which started the Lemony Snicket series of unfortunate events that's about to come. So eventually he bought it in 1990, started to try to make his first wine, got pretty much bullied by the co-op up there, who tried to lock him into a long lease. He wasn't having any of it because he wasn't even sure he wanted to do this. So he had to find a way to make the wine himself. So he finds a place to make the wine. But then learned the hard way that that winery was full of Brett. So undrinkable, the entire 1990 vintage. Vintage is gone. 1991, second vintage, vineyards freeze. Mm-hmm. That's pretty rough. But that's not the only thing that happened too. The winery that they were making those wines in essentially was backed into by a backhoe driver and completely collapsed.
Yep.
All right, so we're on to 91. 92. Sorry. I got this out of order. 91 was the winery was burned down by an arsonist.
That's true. Yes, I forgot that.
92, the winery was rebuilt, then promptly backed into by the backhoe driver. So they had to rehab that Brett-infected winery, so they got a special coating to spray inside the barrels, and they found out upon tasting the wines once they disgorged them that was never applied. So basically they were drinking what tasted like plastic trash cans. So a pretty rough go that would lead anyone to pull out. So Dominique's father decided to try to sell the domain off, and nobody bid on it for 6, 7, 8 years or so. And eventually Dominique took over and leased it from his father. So I mean, like trial by fire. This guy at least deserves for you to taste his wines. Not only are they great, but like this guy's been through enough. Just try the damn wines. You know, it's been a rough go for Dominique, and I haven't met him personally, but Paul, I'm sure you can speak to this. He's just you know,
the nicest
guy, energetic. Yeah,
nicest.
Yeah,
Nicest
very warm,
guy.
jovial character. Yeah.
But, so yeah, you're all see. So we're Pinot Noir and Kimmeridgian, which you know in itself is very different than the Côte d'Or. We're in a Pinot. If you look at the bottom of the label, there's something that says Côte de Grisay, and Côte de Grisay was the famous bit of Épinay back in the 19th century. It was actually famous for whites, by the way. So yeah, on the bottom of there, and it was mentioned in the same branch as the Grand Crus of Chablis, and it was called Les Grisay. But it's a small hill, it's super steep, and it's very Kimmeridgian. There's almost no topsoil, it's white. And basically what you have is a Pinot growing on, and I know you wanted to do Les Danois, but I wanted a chance to show Juliette because it's so red wine grown on a white wine soil, and it's got.
And the Danois was just what I was familiar with, so I actually tasted this for the first time once you sent it to me. It's obviously they don't make a ton of it. I mean,
no, and also it's a wine that can struggle in warm years. So, you know, the source's choice of Danois for 15 is correct because deeper clays, more water retention. This is a really, really, really difficult terroir to work for reds. I don't know of whites grown on it. I'd love to see one because it was really historical. But basically you have, this Pinot grown on one of the most famous terroirs for whites back in the 19th century. And it's, I love with global warming, though not too much, because when it gets dry, they get a little tense. I love these wines. I love reds grown on white soils, whether it's white marl on the top of the Côte d'Or things, because they're so graceful and delicate and fresh. And then behind this, you've got this massive amount of chalk. I mean, it's another expression of Pinot that's not what you get from Côte d'Or, and it's fascinating. I think it's more, I don't know. I don't work in ERLC yet, so I'm not going to talk about it. I don't know it as well, but I think there's more cut. You know, maybe it's more high toned, more chalky.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, not a lot of just also, just to go back, I was saying about the thistles. Why I think that's very appropriate is this has like a finish, almost like some really herbaceous Amaro. You know, it's got that nice little hit
from that whole cluster.
Yeah, the whole cluster, but also just that it's. I don't think we talked. I think we talked about this one of our recent conversations about Pinot and how we don't think of it as being making tannic wines because it's thin skinned, but because of the other elements of Pinot Noir, the tannins actually jump to the forefront quite a bit. So it winds up being a tannin-driven wine, even if it's not a tannic wine. And I think this is a great example. I also think it's really no coincidence that, you know, you mentioned global warming, climate change, whatever, that these wines have started to become popular and frankly have been made even better in the past 10 to 15 years or so. And I think they'll only get a little more so because it's pretty damn cold up there, I'd say. We have one question here, which I think I'll pose to Jeremy. What would you blind this wine as?
I would blind this wine as red Burgundy. This is what red Burgundy is supposed to taste like. And you know, it's a region that's getting warmer from global warming, and that's, you know, benefiting a lot of areas, and it's hurting a lot of areas. But I think in general, in the Côte d'Or, it's getting warmer, you know, on average. And those wines, although they're still incredible wines of the world, they're tasting closer and closer to, you know, great wines of California. I think the lines can be blurred. That might be controversial, but when you have
I'm joking.
More oak and more ripeness, you know, they're definitively Burgundy, but they are feeling warmer and warmer as, you know, the world gets warmer. But this wine in such a more extreme climate, it still has that super taut, underripe, that cranberry, and that whole cluster, twiggy, like it just feels so rustic in the most positive sense of the
In the
word.
positive sense, yeah.
Um,
And
I'm
no,
sorry.
no, I'm sorry, finish. I'm just getting excited because
It-
you know, you mentioned vegetal earlier on, and I'm going to say that my least favorite color in red wine is black. We're getting more and more black vintages, but it's saved when there's a little bit of green in it, like Northern Rhone can do a Syrah, like Mondeuse can do, like the Southwest can do a lot, and places like this, when there's freshness, when there's a little green from the stem that combines in it, suddenly you take those darker vintages we're getting and you're like, okay, I'm happy. Because if it's just black, it doesn't interest me. So the cranberry, the green, you know, all of that, what I call noble vegetal is what make these wines absolutely delicious, refreshing. You want to finish the bottle and you want to have it with food.
And the last thing that I would mention about this wine before we moved on, and something that people might not know, is when the Abbey of Citeaux, the Cistercian Abbey, you know, originally planted vines in Burgundy in 1098. At the same time that they were planting what's now Romney Saint-Laurent and some, you know, very famous vineyards, at that same very time, they had these daughter abbeys, and literally in the same year, they planted the Côte de Grisey. So very early on, they identified this as one of the very best terroirs. And, you know, to me, it still is it's a completely different expression of Pinot Noir. But, you know, I think a lot of people think like Côte d'Or, and then there's everything else, and that might be lesser. But, you know, this is, you know, an area that was identified really, really early on as producing great wines.
Yeah. Okay,
and just as your motivation to get your hands on these wines, the Côte de Grisey, that where the Cuvée Juliette comes from, 2 hectares, which makes it the 3rd biggest of our flight here, which starts off with like 65 hectares for Montbourg. Then we go to like 11.5 for Tauzy. The 2 hectares that this comes from makes it be larger than 3 other wines that we're about to taste, which Absolutely. Is a nice transition to
so yeah, I don't know where to
wine.
start about, you know, what I like most about this wine. So the next wine is Jean-Baptiste Souliard.
It's fucking fantastic. Sorry, I don't know if we're supposed to swear or not, but it's like, this is what I love about Syrah.
So this is the single vineyard Le Bâti from Crozes Hermitage. And I think that Jean-Baptiste is doing something really great in the Rhone. When I started learning about wine and when I was studying, I always thought of Crozes Hermitage as a homogenous region. You read in books, you see maps of Hermitage, and there's never even a map of Crozes Hermitage in most wine books. And a lot of people think that, you know, it's a very homogenous zone that produces lesser wines than Hermitage, and, you know, the soils are the same everywhere. And even up until very recently, most producers weren't doing single vineyard bottlings. Even the most famous Crozes Hermitage, arguably, Alain Graillot, the Laggy Road, it's not a single vineyard, it's a barrel selection. So there's really, you know, a lot left to discover in the terroir. And when I was originally looking through the catalog of which wine I wanted to bring on at Michael Mina, I couldn't decide because I literally hadn't heard of any of the vineyards. So I just bought all of them because I was so excited to see the differences and that there could be, you know, you know, distinction in different vineyards. But this is my favorite personally of all of the Crozes Hermitages, even though I love them all. And the reason that I love this one the most is, so the vineyard itself, Le Bâti, sits about 4,000 meters directly north of Hermitage. And it's one of the closest vineyards to the hill of Hermitage. And while a lot of people think of the soils in this really large region as homogeneous, this vineyard kind of sits on the split. On the northern sector, as you go north in the direction of Côte Rôtie, you have a little bit more granite, you have loess, and if you go, you know, kind of east and south, you have a separate region that's a little bit warmer that has more schist and some galets in the soils. But Le Bâti kind of sits at the confluence of all of those soil types. And there's actually a really great map I was looking at from Fernando Beteta, who's a master sommelier in Chicago. And on his website, he has all these incredible wine maps. And you can see Le Bâti very, very clearly, like on the soil map that he has published on his website. Almost all of the other vineyards maybe just have 1, 2, maybe 3 soil types. And you can't even pick out how many different, there's probably like 10 different soil types in such a small area in Le Bâti. So super, super complex. And it's a wine that I think if I blinded most people on, not only would they think that it's from a more quote unquote prestigious region in the Northern Rhone, they might say it's Côte-Rôtie or Hermitage or Cornas. You know, I think that they would blind it as one of the best producers in those regions. The recipe for the wine, the way his élevage is very similar to a lot of my other favorite producers. He doesn't destem a lot, doesn't use a lot of new oak, and the wines are super, super herbal. They're smoky. They have that intense bacon, black olive quality to them. I just think that they're really, really great classic expressions that, because they happen to be in Crozes Hermitage, I'm currently getting a really great deal on.
Yeah, I would also say that anytime there's a region that I write off or I'm not super excited about, I almost always find myself coming across a wine that is the pinnacle of what that should express, and then I understand everything else that came before it. And that's what I think Souillard does for Crozes Hermitage. It makes me understand what the target is for Syrah from the Crozes Hermitage, and it's just gorgeous. I will say I'm a little biased simply because I think Syrah is the greatest thing in the world. My very first aha wine, Andre Paris Saint-Joseph, was like the first thing to turn me on to wine and what it can be. So I love that black pepper note. And like this just has it in spades. It's so
savory.
Beautiful. Yeah, I mean,
savory.
And we talked a lot about like acidity in wines. We talked about body, sweetness, and all those things. And those things all, are elements of flavor, and they complement flavor when we pair. That's what I love about the black pepper note in Syrah. Is it's not just complementing flavors; it's actually adding another flavor in a lot of ways, and it can do things that a lot of other wines can't, I think.
And I should also mention that there's several other single vineyard Crozes Hermitages that Souillard makes. There's Le Hebrard is another favorite of mine. It's actually not too far. It's probably like only another 1,500 meters from Le Bâti. It's closer to the river. It's a little bit further north, closer to Côte-Rôtie, but it doesn't have as much of the soils that you find in the southeast of the appellation that give a little bit more heftiness to the wines.
Yep.
To me, it resembles, if that resembles more Côte-Rôtie, this resembles Hermitage a little bit more, but they're so subtle, the differences. It's really, really fascinating to taste side by side. And then there's also a white that's made like very close to this too, just a little bit more closer to the river. And that's on lowest soils. The vineyard is called Le Tout, and it is, it's one of my favorite white Rhones at the moment. I've done it on the pairing at Mina. It's just, so vibrant. And when you look at the map of Crozes Hermitage, it's not surprising at all that there's white grapes planted versus red, because the whole map on that vineyard is almost entirely lowest soil, whereas all the vineyards around it are, have a little bit more of that granite.
Yeah. And before we move on, I think it was through Matt, I saw a comment come up about never making generalizations on regions or styles and things like that, because you'll always be proven wrong. That was exactly my point. I've stopped doing that because I used to dislike Chinon. Man, I'm an idiot. I used to dislike a lot of things, and I was absolutely proven wrong. So the most recent one to do that has been Core. So you'll.
But yeah, so you've said everything. I want to keep the last 10 minutes for that, because that's my wine of the year for 2019 for me. But right before that, there's 2 takeaways from this. Look at Crozes Hermitage from north of the hill of Hermitage. That is perfectly well said. It's very different than the south, and is much greater.
Paul, just so you know, your producer, the producer is watching this, so make sure you say nice things.
Who?
All right. And Nicolas comment is online with
hi,
us.
Nicola. Hi, Maya. But just one second. So yeah, guys, do yourself a favor. Investigate crows north of Hermitage. I'm embarrassed I'm having a memory loss, but the Source has a phenomenal crows producer up there as well. So it's a region, and Jean-Baptiste is one of the best. And do yourself a favor. Don't dismiss crows. This is the wine that sold me on him. I agree. It's one of my favorite. Let's move on to Calmet.
The Main de Chassis. The Source?
No.
Let's move on to the
Let's move on. But ask your friendly sommeliers or retailers about crows north of Hermitage. Okay, this is my wine of the year, 2019, because it totally redefines the appellation. And so Cahors was known as black, tannic wines, pretty much undrinkable, that rip your mouth off. And there's a little group of people that started making much better wines. I think one of the first in this area is Fabien Jouve. And I love the wines. We actually talked to him for a bit, but he was already with Zev. So anyway, I was visiting Mathieu Dice at a trade fair, trade tasting, and down in Bordeaux. And he said, "Oh, I have friends here. They just started a domaine in Cahors." And this young couple, we sat down, we chatted. I loved them immediately. Then they took their first vintage tank sample, put it on the table, tasted it, and I was totally blown away because I never tasted Cahors like that. So you have two terroirs in Cahors. Basically, the bottom by the river, which is alluvial. And alluvial can produce very good, very yummy reds, but they never have a ton of minerality. And what I learned that day, because I never paid really attention to Cahors, is that the top of the hills, called Les Causses, is all Kimmeridgian limestone. And so we just had a Kimmeridgian limestone Pinot Noir, and here we go again. So very, very, very assertive terroir. And you can imagine, so almost a hard terroir, and you can imagine that with reds that were maybe underripe, picked with machines, extracted, you know, the result was this, you know, it was called the black wine of Cahors. And there we go. So Maya and Nicolas, who are wonderful people, their first vintage was 2016. They started immediately organic. By the way, everything certified organic, some biodynamic, except for Les Bâtis from Souillard, because it's négociant purchase, but everything else is at least certified organic. And they started from the get-go. They're now certified organic. There will be certified biodynamic, I think, next year. And so in this Kimmeridgian terroir, and they make 5 reds, they make a pet nat, they make other wines. And this is the most serious because there's a very special terroir in this Kimmeridgian soil that's iron rich. And I don't even know how to pronounce it in English. It's called sidérolitique in French, but this is super iron rich. This is called Butte Rouge, the Red Mountain, for that reason. It's super iron rich. And what it brings to this wine is what iron always brings to a wine, even in Burgundy, is this incredibly sexy, savory quality to the wine. They are super talented. They are both enologists. They met in Toulouse. They went to school in Bordeaux. They both started as different things. One, Nicolas was going to be a biologist, and Maya was going to be an agronomist. They both got disappointed by what they were doing, reconverted into finishing and getting their enology diploma. Worked at some pretty famous places, went up to Alsace, which is where they met Mathieu, and this is why I met them. But I don't know what you guys, what your, this I put in the league of a good Northern Rhone wine to me. Yeah. It's got a precision of texture. It's got this crazy savoriness from the iron. It's super complex. It's not cheap for a Cahors, but it's much cheaper than a Northern Rhone, you know, star. And I'm just blown away. It's It's mostly destemmed fruit. I'm going to put that between quotes because you have to destem by law in Cahors. Some whole cluster may have found its way here by accident. Not as a whole cluster kind of thing, but it's more for the drainage of the tank. It was aged in a big 20 hectoliter tank that actually incidentally came from Condria. They're very low sulfur for red without being totally natural. I think they're around 15 total, which is super low. And I want to taste it. But
so what I would say about this is I think for blind tasting purposes, Malbec can always be a little bit tannin and oak driven from Argentina. And I've always found that this style of Malbec really allows me to understand what Malbec is, and it's helped me blind taste Malbec as a whole in general better, because it's got it's just you don't really get at the fruit all that often when you're tasting Argentinian Malbec, and this is a great example of what lies under that oak and that tannin and all that rich body, and it's beautiful.
What I love about this wine, and what I was saying about Crozes Hermitage being really misunderstood as this homogenous region, I think that you could say the same thing about Cahors. There's not really, wine maps of Cahors like there are of Hermitage or Pauillac or, really famous wine regions, but the location of your vineyard is so important there. And it reminds me most, in addition to the Northern Rhone stylistically, it makes me think of Saint-Emilion, where you have producers on that limestone plateau, like Chateau Ozone, for example, that make these super mineral wines with a lot of energy. And then you have wines, kind of in the lower lying clayier vineyards that produce kind of bulkier wines that are really showy sometimes, but they lack the energy that you have from that pure outcropping of limestone. It's really interesting because it's like the same comparison of soil types, but I think of this as like a baby expression of that, and in that people haven't thought about Cahors in that sense. They just think about it as one region that produces this big tannic wine.
To me, this is just in a different league, and it's a really great wine. Hey, guys, I think we're going to have to say goodbye.
Yeah, I think we got 2 minutes. Is there anything else you want to add, Paul? I know we talked about getting these.
No, I think we should do this again and pick 3 wines. One each.
Talk more about them.
But I want to thank you guys for the opportunity to talk about wines that are, more ignored. Even Alsace, Dice, a famous, Alsace is, for some reason, whatever. So this was great. Thank you. I'm glad to talk about these wonderful producers, and there we go.